All right, you're on.
Hi, and welcome to the 13th Literacy Research Association Research to Practice show. Hard to believe we've been at this for over a year. So today's topic is space and place in digital literacies research, and we have a wonderful panel. So I'm going to ask them to go ahead, starting over on the left. I'm going to ask that we introduce ourselves. So go ahead, Heather.
My left?
Sure, start. You can start, Heather. We'll go with that. You can be at my left today.
Okay. So I was actually just looking back at the Twitter feed that I think prompted this whole group to start thinking and talking together. And it happened in, when was that? Ryan and Julie. Oh, here we go. Like May of 2012? Is that right?
Yep.
Wow. So I just sent out a tweet. I was thinking about conferences, and I was thinking about how much I was enjoying work that related to digital media, youth, arts, literacy, and I knew that there were folks out there that were doing great work because I had met many of them at other conferences. And so I just sent out a tweet that said, hey, who's interested in doing a conference on literacy, art, digital media, youth? And Ryan and Julie messaged back, and we started talking. And we were all at different institutions in the Deep South. And we wanted to see what would happen if we got a group of scholars together who were all interested in issues of literacy that affected youth. And we wanted to do it such that place was foregrounded because we were in the South. We knew that, so we were doing projects. We knew other people that were doing great projects. And we really just wanted to see what would happen if we started talking and thinking together about what it means to put place into the conversation in a way that maybe it hadn't been, particularly in our geographic region. Is that about right?
Sorry to cut you off. I'm really excited to hear about place, but I do want to just go through the introductions first.
Oh, right.
And no, we need that context. And for those who don't know, this is an initiative for going into this next year of the Research to Practice show. We're really trying to bring the study groups at the forefront, and we're going to hear more about how Heather kind of led this initiative to launching the study group. But if we could start, if anybody want to just jump in and introduce themselves, tell us, where you're from and how you came to this group as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm Julie Warner, and I'm an assistant professor of writing and linguistics at Georgia Southern University, and I am located in the coastal South. And as Heather explained, I had reached out after her call for finding other researchers that were located in the geographic South or in rural areas who were interested in exploring youth literacy practices.
Okay, anybody else?
Heather, did you want to finish introducing yourself?
Oh, sure. My name's Heather Pleasance. I'm so sorry about that, guys.
No, it's it's okay.
I get so excited about this work. So I'm at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa and do a lot of work in this area in the West Alabama region.
Oh, nice. Ryan, do you want to hop in now?
Sure. So I'm Ryan Risch, English Ed professor at Kennesaw State University, and I guess would be the suburban South outside of Atlanta. And yeah, for all those reasons, I think I've done research in rural areas and didn't maybe conceptualize it the way that I would have liked to, and so I was attracted to this group because of the people, but also because of this concern for space and place and literacy research.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I'm Lindy Johnson. I am an assistant professor of English education at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, but my dissertation research took place in the rural South, and I was also really interested in the idea of kind of foregrounding place in my research, specifically as it applied to the rural South.
And I'm Damiana Gibbons-Piles, and I am an assistant professor in media studies at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. And my dissertation research looked at rural and urban youth making digital productions, mostly about their lives, and I was really interested in what rurality really meant when it came to media literacy, specifically, and to literacy more generally. So Ryan asked if I wanted to be part of this group, and I said yes, absolutely, because there's just not enough research about what rural literacies look like.
Oh, and so thank you, folks. So let's get back to Heather. Let's turn it back to you. Tell us a little bit now about this study group. What do you see as its kind of the goals, and what are you looking forward to having happen, since we're just, the conference is just around the corner, so we're really excited to kind of highlight this new study group right before we all head down to Florida.
Well, our first goals, I think, started off pretty modest. We wanted to get together and do a series of readings related to space and place, and think and talk together about how those readings reflected our own questions about space and place in literacies research, but also about how those readings might not be capturing some of the issues and questions that we had within and outside of our own work. So over the course of about a year, we did readings, and we took turns hosting a reading group, and we posted those reading group sessions to our blog. So we had somebody who would take responsibility for a particular theme or issue. They would select the readings, and then we had at least one person from the group who would write a response based on their own thoughts, ideas, and questions associated with those readings. And then with that as a context, then we would get together and talk about what emerged for us based on the readings. And from that, we started thinking about, all right, so we've done these readings, we kind of have a foundation, and we have some questions that have sort of been consistent over time. How do we want to take our, I don't know, meditations on those questions and put them into a format that results in some kind of scholarly product?
Well, I'm going to play with those formats right now and those meditations. So to switch it up a little bit for this show, we usually start off by defining those, those constructs. Like I tell my, my pre-service teachers all the time, yeah, when you're writing, you need to define your keywords, and we just use different words like constructs for keywords that we tell our sixth graders to define. So, but to switch it up a little bit, I want you to define the construct of place in terms of literacy, but I want you to draw that real quick. I'll give you about 2 minutes, and draw your definition of place for us. And then we're going to share, and then that's how we're going to go through and define your ideas. So if you guys go ahead, get started at 8:08. I'll bring us back together at 8:10. But while they're doing that, I do just want to kind of highlight some things that are going on at the conference coming up. And for those who can't draw nice, that's okay. You can draw mean. But how does place define something without words? Because it's, meaning in itself, that's been a constant theme through these shows, is how our affordances for meaning are really changing. And it's just nice. So we got about a minute left. These shows are sponsored by the Technology Committee. We have an open meeting. We'd have to really like to welcome anybody into the shows. And if there's other study groups out there who would like to get involved in hosting a show, please contact either Ian or myself, or anybody that's also a producer or host of the show. And we can, schedule in for a month. We're always looking to pick up new topics and new ideas. It really helps when members bring the ideas to us. And so we have about 30 seconds left, and then we'll start with Damania showing us exactly how she would define space. Or sorry, not space, but place. And we'll talk about how space plays with place in a little bit. All right, so that's 2 minutes. So, Damania.
Okay. So maybe you can, I don't know if you can see this, but basically for me, space and place always have to do with identities. So it's always who you are, or where you're projecting yourself virtually. So if your place is, like say I'm right now in my house, but my space is Google Hangouts. But it's who I am in these different places, and who you all are, and who our other viewers are, my grandma or whoever. Who else is in this place and space? So for me, it's always about identities. So I drew people.
Oh, nice. How about Julie? Julie, how about you?
Yeah, let's see if you can.
Yeah, we can see that.
Piece of artwork. I just drew place, and I was thinking about Savannah, where I am located physically right now, and that's how I define place, is as a physical location, and space would be the social situation, and place is a part of space, but not wholly constitutive of space.
Okay. Heather, do you want to show us what you have?
Okay, I was kind of cheating.
I
So this is kind of, I don't know if you can see it, but
Yeah.
they're stick figures. One person is on their phone, and they're texting about place while they're walking, and they're thinking about themselves at another time when they were trying to figure out what place meant. So I think for me, place is, like Julie just said, it's a construct, but it also is grounded in physicality and materiality. So even while we're trying to figure it out in different modes of communication, we're still moving through different kinds of physical spaces that inform those thoughts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes great sense. And it makes me think, is there a difference between presence and being present, especially when you're occupying those multiple spaces and identities at the same time? Lindy?
Yeah, this is my total kindergarten drawing. That's a map of the United States right there, and you can see that this is my. So my thinking about place, and specifically with my work with teachers in the rural South, was that I situate and think about place as a physical reality, a physical place that you can point to on a map. And so this place of being in rural Georgia, and specifically in the place of schools, which is where my dissertation research took place, totally affects the idea of space. And so, but for me, place is about that physical location and the history of that physical location associated with it, and how that and that all informs the space and identity. But for me, the space is like, it's much more of this kind of broader concept. That the place is the physical part of it. That's how I.
Nice. And Ryan, what's your contribution to our little art show?
Yeah, very similar. So I don't know if you can see that.
Yep.
Okay, so I kind of see place as geography, and so those little dots are people, and that place is permeable. It's not a container, but people come in, come out, stay, move. But then I'm very concerned with mobility and artificial boundaries that are drawn by school attendance zones, HOAs, you name it, that kind of shape how people move and interact, across those artificial boundaries or arbitrary boundaries, and how bodies are policed in particular in those geographies. And so, who can be where when, who can't be where when, all those kind of things. So it's very bound in materiality and geography.
Oh, and as literacy researchers, especially those working, say, in transnationalism, or working with populations who have more mobility, where the borders of stability and mobility kind of collide, it is a huge impact, and more so on the classrooms, and most importantly on the lives of students. You each discussed. Thanks. That was actually a new first on our show, is having people draw their key definitions. But you each described rural as being a kind of guiding factor in how you came together. That you were all sharing this idea of a rural space. What do we really mean by rural as literacy, or rural as a place? And according to your definitions, because most of you talked about physical, like there was a mention of that space is a social situation, but you all brought up place as a very physical construct, like it has to exist. So what did you guys mean if by a physical space of rural? I don't even know if rurality is a word. It's hard to say, but rural as a physical space.
Well, I think that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to jump in real quick and say maybe what we didn't mean, because I think a lot of us started out with not liking the way rural is conceptualized as a place that is not suburban or not urban, right? So it's defined by what it's not rather than what it is.
Yeah, and I wanted to just jump in because I think that part of our conversation that's been really interesting is that we've been trying to trouble this notion of rurality. So there are specific guidelines that are kind of outlined by the federal government about what X number of people equals a rural setting, or X number of miles from an urban center equals a rural place. And I think for a lot of us, especially for myself as someone who is not originally from the South or from a rural area, I tended to define rural in those terms, and it was kind of like I was taking my normative discourse and expectations from being in Boston and being in an urban center and using that lens to define what it means to be in a rural place. So I think it's a really complicated question, but it's one that we've been trying to work through. And one of the things that has kind of come out of my dissertation research is, and one of the ways that I'm trying to define rural is that people tend to stay in my dissertation research. People tended to stay in the place that they were raised. So all of the teachers, I worked with 12 teachers. 10 of those teachers actually were born in that town and graduated from the middle school and high school that they were now teaching at. So that's been like a really important definition that affects kind of the context and the space of the school.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of push and pull because a lot of academics, like I'm an academic who grew up in a very rural area in Wyoming, but I don't live in Wyoming. And I've been lots of different places, London, Madison, Wisconsin, like all these different places that are not rural, right? But we work often in places that are not where we are from, right? So, but the people we often talk to in rural literacies tend to stay where they are from. And so what does that mean in terms of what literacy means and what are their literacy practices? So for instance, in the current research I'm doing, it's in a very small school in a very rural area, and those people plan to stay there forever. But the education, the literacy practices that are happening in school are to prepare them to leave, to not live in that community, right? So there's this dynamic happening about do you stay, do you go, and if you go, are you still rural? Are you still part of the community? Mm-hmm. Or have you left it behind? So that's a really push-pull for a rural person.
And I think that gets back to what you're saying as places being so connected to identity, mm-hmm. And getting into that. And so I was interested because you also bring up this intersection of digital literacies in this concept of being stuck in one space when the boundaries of time and space, steal from ideas of chronotopes are just suddenly broken down. So how does that fit into this picture of this physical space of rurality? Rural places. I can't say the word. I don't know how you guys do it. I can't say the word rurality.
Too many R's. My dissertation research looked at 3 young people that were rurally located who were avid users of smartphones, and because of some of the geographic or some of the limitations that were tied to geography, they didn't have the broadband internet access at home. So kids were dependent on smartphones for internet access. And so what I was looking at were the ways that they were afforded mobility. In some ways they're traveling with their phones, and then because of the haptic nature of the phone with the touch screen, they're traveling through these digital spaces at the same time. And so where are they located? What's salient about their travels for literacy?
Yeah, and those are it's where does that get located? And so it's like the definitions kind of being redefined. I'm very involved with Gear Up, and it's so interesting because I work in a northeastern urban schools district. I mean, where I'm in 4 schools, a lot of the Gear Up programs are over 400 miles, and they use technology as a way to kind of connect. So how do you see kind of what is it meant when these populations that Ryan said are either worried about are either too mobile, or as others, there's issues of access with internet or the mobile, just skipping only having mobile phones. How does this connection, this ability to connect, change place in terms of literacy? Or space in general? How do place and space change when you're seen as an outsider if you do leave? Anyone want to hop in on that?
Well, I think, at least in my study, I saw that youth were using technology to create new spaces. One of my participants was a ninth grader who had already been at 3 different high schools by the time we met, and she created a Twitter account just so that she could gather with her friends that were dispersed across all these different schools in the region. And so she really agentically created this space to hang out, essentially. But then other participants were doing space creation types of activities through, one participant was an avid taker of selfies, and he would dress up in different clothes and pose in different ways with different backdrops and use different apps to alter the photos. And he was, he's not a fashionista. He would kill me if he heard me say that, but he's creating a space for himself as
curating identities.
Yeah.
Heather.
Greg, I just wanted to jump in because I think this is something that the group has talked about, and I think it's interesting in terms of, we tend to ascribe, the fact that, if we're connected to technologies, then it has these potentials for creating new spaces and for kind of problematizing physical location. But that's not always necessarily the case. I mean, I think that in my school setting particularly, there were lots of examples where technology, because, the Race to the Top funds, there was a big push to connect the school and bring in more technology into the school. But what was happening is that teachers were pretty much replicating traditional, school kind of literacies. And so the technology can also be used just to replicate what's already going on. So that's something that, I think our group has kind of talked about, this idea that we tend to say, oh yeah, technology, it's going to just blow up the idea of place and space. But definitely there's evidence to the contrary with that, at least in my research.
And it's dangerous as well, because a lot of the ethos behind this push to integrate technology is all about creating these globalized learners. And that's often at the expense of local places.
Yep.
Well, but you have these rise of these apps like Yik Yak, which are completely anonymous, zip code based discussions, and in a way, I work at Southern, which is in New Haven, and Yale's in New Haven. They're 2 very different places, but when you use the same zip code for Yik Yak, you realize there's not that much difference between the students at Yale and New Haven. So we do have this little in these Facebook groups that are very localized. Well, they're usually just full of parents complaining about something, not our teenagers complaining about anything anymore. But how there's a local element, not just a global element to digital spaces. Did you see any of that in your research?
I don't know if I would call it local, or if I would characterize it as being anchored in certain ways by how people have lived, how they live in the past, how they live in the present, and then how digital literacies help them to either maintain that anchor or to move in different ways in different places than they have been before. I was thinking about the dichotomy that we draw between, being in one place or moving, and I think that what the use of digital literacies does is it complicates that dichotomy in a way, but I think what we always have to remember is that the literacies that people use are always situated in particular places. They may go other places from there, but they have their origin in a specific place and space. So, you know, when you participate in a Facebook community, or if you are in a particular school environment and you move and you're maintaining connections with friends, or if you're taking pictures of where you're from and sharing that with other people, there's always this kind of foundation of, you know, an initial relation to people and place that I think is at the heart of those literacy practices, if that makes sense.
And that's going to be a takeaway for me, that, you know, that those digital spots are either a way to set anchor or pull up anchor and set sail. I really like that metaphor as the anchor. So when we're saying place and space, are we just saying culture then? Is that because I'm hearing about identities, and I'm hearing about I know you know, we've been talking about this issue in literacy research forever, like where are the boundaries, but are we just saying culture? Is that, how is it, if you're explaining this to somebody in an elevator, why, and they just said, you just mean culture, don't you? What would be your response? I'm gonna repeat the question for Ryan when he gets back on.
Yeah.
We'll throw him under the bus too when he signs back in. Can you hear us, Ryan?
I don't think of it necessarily as I mean, I guess you could talk about it in terms of culture. I tend to think of it in terms of activity systems because I work from a cultural historical activity theory lens. But I do think that there is a connection, again, you know, going back to this idea of like the material realities of certain places, that is very connected to your physical geography. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's you know, it's not, we've been talking about it, and you know, where you take, you know, with Jim G going and considering affinity spaces versus community practice, and community practice ever since we really started bringing in anthropology into our literacy researchers, and that's not the only field. I think, you know, I see a lot of this research being influenced by literary theorists too, like especially, you know, and especially this is kind of like those, a lot of you teach in secondary English education, and a lot of this work is coming out of literary theory in a sense. So who would you say, if you were to, you know, if you had to make the Mount Rushmore of this kind of research going back from, who should be the 3 people I should go read right now? Current or old? You can go anywhere, or just a space. Like if you want to say the XMCA listserv. Oops, I just said that. But you know, where should be the 3 places I go, or the 3 people I read?
Well, I would say for rural literacies, we looked at a book, an anthology called Rethinking Rural Literacies, and that gives a good grounding about what is different, what is distinctive about literacies in rural places versus urban, and how can we begin thinking about this. So when we talked about that, that's where we turned to. So Bill Green, Michael Corbett, Barbara Comer. These are some of the you know, Kai Schaff. These are the people who are really working on what does it mean to have literacy in a rural place as distinct from an urban, as you know, so trying to set a tone for it.
So that's, you know, and it's so interesting to keep this intersection of everyone researching rural literacies on top of the digital literacies, and that's such a very unique perspective. And Heather and Ryan, I want to turn back to you, as you guys were explaining how the book study group kind of talked about. So we analyzed that kind of as a digital space, even though it was about rural literacy in a sense. You chose to give everybody their own space, their own blog, and then had that kind of get pushed out, versus building a silo, or like, you know, like, hey, join this Facebook page or join this. What's the difference between, you know, having your own space online versus joining other spaces? Is there a difference? Am I just pulling it, you know, am I just making things up right now? But do you see there's something unique there about having your own space, your own blog, versus being somewhere else and pushing your content out onto the world? So I wanted to, you know, I'll just stop talking.
I think initially we affiliated by geography, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was, and it's an argument that we hope to make. We have anecdotes, but we hope to make at some point an argument that the Southeast, by and large, has been overlooked or underrepresented by literacy research, in particular digital literacy research. And so we came together, I think, out of a need to call attention to where we were conceptualizing our work and where we were conducting our studies, and also to have those people in those places represented. The choice to create a blog site, I think, and help me guys, but I think it was I think we wanted to, it kind of fell into open scholarship, where we wanted to have a conversation that was open and learn out in the open, which is messy and risky and dangerous and vulnerable, right? But to have a conversation amongst each other, but then that was available and inviting to others. Yeah, so I think that was, does that capture it?
Yeah, I think that really does. And spaces being open or closed, it's a whole other discussion we could have. But that, I think we already had that show.
And Greg,
go ahead, Lindy.
Yeah, just in terms of people to read, I think, I have, and I know other people in the group have been really, and this whole idea of place and space has been really informed by critical geography, right?
Yes.
So if people are interested in this idea, it really, the foundational work kind of comes from critical geography, and Edward Soja specifically is somebody who has really influenced my thinking, and I think a lot of our thinking around this idea of investigating place and space.
Lindy, how would you, for the audience, how would you define critical geography? Because that's a term that that's new to me as well.
Oh wow, that's well, I think Ryan is actually better.
Okay, Ryan. The football's been kicked to you.
Answer that question.
Either that or it was Lucy pulling the football out. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I'd add Tim Cresswell's work to that as well.
Yeah.
But I think it's bringing that critical lens from critical theory to geography. When I talk to my colleagues in geography who do critical geography with the mapping software and take a look at social issues in terms of how they manifest in people's mobilities and geographies, that's kind of what they're talking about. But there's also this idea of the difference between place and space, and also a history of a place, right? And so understanding if a geography has taken shape in a particular way, well, what are the historical factors that led to that? What are the people factors involved? What are the social issues? And I think that's particularly why we're drawn to try to understand the Southeast, because it has a history that's unique and that has definitely shaped its geography and how people orient themselves and affiliate to that geographic place. And so I think that's we see the Southeast as a particularly generative place for talking about these issues and thinking through these things. And I think after we kind of conceptualize things here, I think it's an opportunity for other folks to look at their own geographies and their own places with that kind of a careful consideration.
That's nice.
Yeah, and I totally threw Ryan under the bus on that, and I'm sorry, but I also just want to add that there's this idea that we act on geography, we act on the physical places that we inhabit, but they also act on us, and they affect us. So there is that really interesting relationship that I had not spent a lot of time thinking about before joining this group, and I think it's really interesting to think about how that interrelationship of us acting on the land and the land acting and kind of affecting us and our daily lives and literacy practices and everything that goes in with that.
So yeah, so it's space is geography and space is actually our environment, so that's a whole other issue. And to wrap up this kind of first section, what do you see as the perils and promises of leave it to teachers to come up with some alliteration of digital tools in rural spaces? What are those kind of promises you see? What are some of the dangers or troubles, or what arises when you look about digital tools in rural spaces?
Well, I think for me, kind of linking between the previous discussion and this one, and to kind of put in a plug for my favorite three, or my three that I think would relate, I would say Appadurai, Soja, and Cresswell. And the critical geography piece, for me, is really nicely stated by Cresswell, because he talks about mobility being all about power. and the way that power is leveraged in how people can move, why they move, and what prevents them from being able to move in different ways, if you consider movement to be a metaphor or an actual physical thing that folks do. And then looking at the way that critical geographers have examined migration patterns and transportation, and then taking that into a different kind of mobility when we talk about literacies, I think is really powerful. So, you know, if there's a danger, I think it's in not continuing to take up the idea that there is an unlimited way that kids can be mobile through their use of digital literacies, that doesn't pay enough attention to differentials in power and the way that those power relationships are played out in different kinds of social spaces.
And I do agree. I think more and more our digital spaces are becoming more and more constrained by our social networks. That we naturally, or even in our digital worlds, we're building up our own fences through how we interact and how we share, and even the tools themselves are now pulling from our circles. So it's almost in a sense that mobility, the more age the network gets, the less mobility we, in a way, end up with online as it's maturing. And it's so that's an important point. And so let's use that as kind of jumping off. And I'd like to start with Damani and just go down the line, around the horn, as they say on that sports ball show. And tell me a little bit about how you're wrestling with the issue of space, or digital, or rural in your research, or all three in some combination. So let's just, go down the line.
Well, I'm really concerned about, right now I'm just trying to focus on what rural means, but there are so many different spaces that these young people are inhabiting in the school that I'm looking at, and who are they within those different spaces. So for instance, if they're using Letterland, which is a package program from the UK, but they're using it in this very small rural southeastern school, what does it mean, when they're having to grapple with different ways of seeing the world through this packaged program? And I look at multimodality, so I'm all about signs and symbols and who we are when we're communicating with each other. So what does it mean when a young person who says the word ain't, as a form of everyday speech, what does it mean when they are confronted with something that's so standardized and mainstreamed to learn their literacy practices? So it's things like that, like what are the push-pulls for those young people and the teachers who are trying to teach them.
You mean the Letterland with the letter people?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, absolutely. I love Letterland. It is so fascinating. For a multimodality person, it's fascinating.
My son went to, and he is kindergarten teacher. She's about a 30-year veteran, and she still uses the letter people. And it was amazing, because the school had tried to move it out so many times, but just set in her ways. But everybody in that town talked about, that's what they remembered the most about school. And I went back and looked at some of them, from the first edition, I think it was 77. All the vowels were female and all the males were consonant, or there was just really gender role. And then you look at the latest published letter people, and those kinds of things have kind of switched around. So no, sorry, that was just I've just been thinking about that a little bit, so it's been fun. So Heather, how about you?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure, yeah. So how are you wrestling with some of these issues in your research?
Okay, all right. Well, issues of space. For me, it really has to do with how do we sustain a practice that's authentic. A lot of the work that I do is in an out-of-school context, and so if kids are being if they're gaining access to particular kinds of tools that provide opportunities to be agentive in certain kinds of ways, and they're wanting to continue to use those skills and abilities across contexts, in what ways is that possible, or in what ways is that challenged by the fact that they exist in these multiple worlds of school, of out of school, at home, church? I'm particularly concerned about the extent to which kids are civically engaged, because I think that a lot of the the rhetoric and rationale for an increase in digital literacy practices has to do with kids being active learners, and then by extension going out into the world and being active participants in society. And I don't know, I think the challenge for me is, all right, in what ways do we see that happening, and how do we see that happening across contexts, or do we see that happening across contexts?
Getting back to that non-monolithic kind of idea. And Julie, how about you?
Yeah, what I'm thinking about right now is how to make spaces more legible for youth. I noticed in my research that kids didn't really seem to have a sense of the global flows, as I've heard them called. And as you mentioned, a lot of their connections seem to mirror their offline connections. And so the promises of technology to overcome their remote location or their isolation or the lack of resources that the kids had went really unfulfilled. And then I saw kids too, I saw evidence that they weren't really able to read the spaces that they inhabited. For example, kids taking up commercialized discourses when they're writing in these really commercialized spaces and not recognizing that pervasive feature. So, you know, how can we make spaces more legible for youth?
Or maybe they do recognize it. I was listening to kind of the Hive Chicago talk where they had Dana Boyd on there, and the kids were like, yeah, we're okay with interacting with brands on Twitter because we know we kind of get some value out of it. But they are interacting in a very commercial way, or that's just a conversation that we need to have. Sorry, I'm reading our chat bar over here, and we're talking about how our attention span is affected by these digital spaces. I know that's a challenge. That's my personal challenge. Think switching. So, Lindy, how about you?
So my work is I'm continuing to work with teachers and figuring out meaningful ways to bring in digital media into their classrooms in ways that draw on students' identities and subjectivities. So one of the things that I've been really influenced by that Soja said is, you know, as critical geographers, they have to kind of think about what are the places that are worth fighting for. And so I love this idea of, you know, that public schools are still places worth fighting for. And I feel like a lot of people, a lot of researchers have given up on researching in schools because, you know, they think teachers don't know what they're doing, or they feel like they're under-resourced, or that nothing innovative is happening in schools. So I'm continuing to kind of push that agenda for more people to be researching in schools and supporting teachers as they help students develop digital literacies. And so that's a big thing I'm thinking about. The other thing that I'm really worried about is this idea of, as we talk about this kind of globalized culture that is going on, there's a tendency towards uniformity, and I think that we see, and standardization. And so I think that we kind of saw that with the Common Core, and you know, this idea that a lot of the new digital software, a lot of it is kind of like pre-packaged for us, right? So it's very like template heavy, and so so I'm really concerned about that, and that's something that I want to continue to think about with teachers. So yeah, that's kind of where I am in my research right now.
Ryan?
Yeah, I share Lindy's. I think we all do a commitment to schools and into understanding how this all plays out in classrooms and with teachers. And I've been across a couple of projects, but also with my pre-service teachers, been thinking about within the backdrop of the Metro Atlanta area where attendance zones are gerrymandered. I mean, there's histories you can read about for why the attendance zones are drawn the way they are. And you know, increasingly dividing us up by class and race to the point that we're approaching statistics that look more like pre-Brown versus Board of Ed, right? Mm-hmm. And then thinking about school as maybe the one place where people are converging from, so a convergence of froms, I called it in the Twitter chat. that led up to this. But thinking about the classroom as maybe the only place where people are interacting across neighborhoods or across real and imagined, lines that are drawn by class and race and that kind of thing, by neighborhoods and that kind of stuff. And so, what do you do with a class that is a convergence of froms, where people are from different places? And then if you are in a homogeneous place, and I'm working on developing a project now where we're going to network classrooms across schools and examine social issues and share out some digital media that they're going to produce. And so how do classrooms become audiences for other classrooms? And then what does that mean to kind of collapse or at least try to circumvent these boundaries that divide these kids across, like I'm saying, class and race and that kind of stuff? These boundaries that we've erected by these geographies. And what happens? What happens when we understand each other, not just in terms of who we are by typical identity markers, but who we are by where we're from? And what is it like to understand someone else's from? And so that's kind of how I've been thinking about these particular issues.
And that's why I think we were really excited to do the LRA study group, because we're then a bunch of researchers who are, like as Ryan says, a convergence of froms. And we come from different places, and we can all come together and try to make sense of who we are and what's happening in our research when it comes to these kinds of issues. And that's why we're so excited about doing that. Yeah. And some of us are going to have to do it digitally, unfortunately, me. But it'd be really fun to be in that room, to have a bunch of people together who are really trying to wrestle with what's happening with these issues. It'll be exciting.
The convergence of froms.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be my next album title, my next indie rock band. I just need an instrument and a band. I got the title, so I'm all set. But so you've talked about mobility in space as sources of power or a way of control or lack of thereof. So my question is then, should research into spaces, should we be trying to document space or transform space?
I think the documentation has to be a first step. Just thinking about what we were just talking about and what a lot of our conversation was in the first year that we met, we did a lot of trying to unpack where we were from. Most of us are transplants to the South, and so what does that mean? Most of us are white folks, so what does that mean?
Yep.
And many of us in the group have come from different places or have been in different places throughout the course of our lives, and so what does that mean? And developing a critical kind of meta-level awareness of what place means to us as we do the work that we do, I think sort of mirrors, what I hope, and I think a lot of us want to do with the folks that we work with. The kids in schools that we work with, the kids out of school, adults as well. Encouraging criticality around place. So first is the documentation. You got to have that as a first step, and then once you've documented, okay, so what does this mean? In our documentation, are we recreating romantic notions of the places that we inhabit? In what ways are we bringing a critical sense to place that we're from, that other people are from, in the kinds of literacy practices that we're enacting?
So what does this all mean for, thanks Heather, that summed it up. And what, to the whole panel, what does this mean for the classroom teacher? How should I be thinking about place and space and how I take up digital literacies in my rural classroom?
So I'll jump in because I have an example from my research.
Thank you, Lindy.
So I think teachers really need to think about the specific affordances of different digital tools and look for opportunities, however small they may seem, for students to be able to bring in, to use mobile technologies, usually their phone or device, and to capture things to bring into the classroom. So two quick examples. I had a teacher who was doing American Romantic literature, like very traditional school type, literature, and they had to do, the students had to do a journal from an explorer. And so the teacher asked the students to go out in their physical space and explore some area of their neighborhood or their little small town, and then bring that back into the classroom. So students were able to like draw on their knowledge of physical local space and bring it into the curriculum. And she found that students were much more engaged, and that it allowed her as a teacher to really get to know things about her students that she wouldn't normally have known. So I think looking for opportunities, however small they may be, and for teachers to bring those kinds of activities in and to let kids be using the digital technologies to record, take pictures of things in their community can be really powerful.
Yeah, and to build on that, and also what Heather was saying in response to your question about documenting or transforming, there are some documentations of places and spaces that we might want to transform. So thinking about critical representations of places, specifically in the South, we have TV shows like Duck Dynasty, Honey Boo Boo, Moonshiners. You know, can we bring that to kids, have them unpack that, and, you know, critically analyze, well, okay, are all Southerners unintelligent, crude? Is this somehow tied to geographic place? You know, and can we speak back to this?
I'm glad to hear you didn't throw King of the Hill under the bus. I'm from Garland, Texas, so well, the show's set in Ireland, but it's Garland. But yeah, so this idea of this critical need, and bringing this in. So building off of what Julie said about this idea of, you know, this space being defined in mass media, what have we learned from this kind of research that we can bring, that we can pass on to teachers, building off of what Julie just added?
Well, one tension I think we should probably at least name is like when we're identifying social issues in a particular place, that we're careful not to do so as outsiders. So we don't swoop in and say, oh, did you know you have this problem? Let's address that, right? And I think that has to be done in negotiation. I think like that criticality, that critical consciousness or systemic awareness, whatever we want to call it, is done in a way where people come to an understanding of their place kind of on their own terms and in their own histories, and that we don't swoop in with a deficit perspective and lay out like all that's wrong with a particular place, or romanticize a place, you know, and swoop in and say like, oh, this is bucolic and everything's great. And you know, I think there's maybe a dialogue there, or a dialectic that has to happen around issue identification, even in terms of what we pay attention to and what we foreground in a particular place.
Yeah, and I think that that's especially true when we're working with young people. So, you know, they're trying to figure out a sense of who they are as people. And so if we go in and we say, you're from a rural area, that means that you are lacking, that you lack real literacy, that you lack all of these different things. You need to move to a city. You need to push out in order to be a good person. And that's often told in terms of literacy acts, you know. And so we want to be very careful when we're doing these kinds of place-based education activities, these literacy practices, that we're honoring what's happening there without romanticizing it. And it's a very fine line that people have to do, but it's something that's very important. So teachers can go in and they can do these activities without saying, you know, without...
Learn to read this book or you'll never get out of this town.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that Demiana brings up something important that's been important, I think, in all of our research, but this idea of just like, I mean, part of the reason that we all wanted to get together was because we felt that there was an underrepresentation of Southern voices. So part of my research is also about making sure that the voices of the teachers that I'm working with are heard and that their experiences are shared, because I think sometimes as researchers, as kind of Ryan kind of alluded to, that it's really easy for us to go in as outsiders and then, you know, reflect back to the wider, broader world, like, well, this is what's happening, these are the issues, these are the problems, but we also need to kind of give voice to our participants and allow them to speak authentically about their experience themselves, and I think documenting their experience is, in and of itself, a transformative practice.
I'd also add to that, making sure that when we're attending to place and space, that we continue to pay attention to history and chronology, because in the documentation process, especially with youth, we have them going out and taking pictures and collecting audio of where they're at right now. And I think it's important for them to have a longer time frame of understanding, to maybe be in places in their community that have a particular kind of political, social, or cultural history over time, and but then also to have ways to connect their present experience to what may have occurred in the past. Because, being in the South, we have a very rich, complicated history around a lot of different issues, and helping kids to understand that the place that they are at right now has a history that has impacted who they themselves are. I think that's really, really important, that we're not ahistorical in the work that we do around digital literacies.
So since this is such an important point, let's use Heather's comment as kind of our closing. How can these digital spaces, how can they allow students to kind of understand and reimagine either their material and physical spaces or their historical realities? How are these digital tools allowing this kind of transgression or understanding or even remixing these kinds of historical realities?
Well, there's so many tools now that make it so easy to map your space, and youth could map the access to resources just in the space that they're in. So how are literacy resources distributed in a space? How is the cultural capital distributed? And map things like libraries, museums, schools.
And I want to actually use this as our closing note, so if you guys all want to kind of finish on this point. Demanio, how do you think that we can use these, or how does the rural identity explore in this idea of historical realities, or because I know you're coming more from that background?
Right. Well, in my dissertation research, I looked at nonprofits, youth media arts organizations, and we did specifically one in Appalshop. And Appalshop has this long history of representing Appalachian people by Appalachian people themselves, rather than a mainstream kind of representation. So they use all kinds of digital tools in order to explore what that means to be an Appalachian person. And so that's where my perspective comes from. And then we bring those kinds of things into schools instead of having them outside of schools.
And Lindy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this idea of, building on students' interests and their subjectivities and what's important to them, and then helping them learn how to navigate the tools in specific ways. So and I like that Heather brought up this idea of civic engagement, and I worked with some kids in Georgia around civic engagement, and seeing them use Facebook and Instagram to kind of connect with other activists, help them reimagine their identities as I'm a young activist. So they definitely have that potential. I think they need, in a lot of cases, a lot of guidance and scaffolding from teachers, or either in or out of school spaces, but there are definitely possibilities around that.
Fine line between a collectivist and an activist.
Yep.
But I look at it, I'd rather have kids be civic and community ready before college and career, because I think the latter will come if you have the first. And I think we have that kind of focus on changing your spaces and having a sense of agency, and your ability to reshape your world can really inform what we mean by space. Ryan?
So probably, is that me?
Yeah.
Hold on. Go to somebody else and then I'll come back. Let me
mute yourself. Heather, do you have any kind of final thoughts on this kind of idea of understanding or transgressing or reimagining those historical realities that you kind of launched this discussion on?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the thing that I'm really passionate about is having multi-generational, multimodal literacies practiced by youth. So if you have somebody in your community, if you have somebody in your family who has done something important, then you should talk to them about what they did and why. And not only should you talk to them, you should find out, right, so who was the person that influenced them, right? Because if you talk to, for example, a 10-year-old and they're talking about their, 30-year-old or 40-year-old relative. That person has somebody in their life that is probably 60 or 70. And very quickly, particularly in the South, you get to a point where you are kind of right up against those kinds of social, political, cultural issues that have continued to define not only what goes on in the South, but what goes on in our nation and in the world, really. So I think taking a multi-generational approach is really, really important.
Ooh, this idea of the multi-generational is, I think, so critical. I mean, because that this sense of mentoring. I mean, that's what literacy is. It's a multi-generational practice that we hand down. It's not, we don't learn strategies. We exchange them with our peers and, activity. So yeah, so that's great. So we're at the end of the show. So let's start at Brian now and work our way down. Just where can we find you? This is your chance to plug. Where are your spaces online where people can find out where you're working or tweeting? Or anything you want to plug as our kind of final note, because we need people to come to our spaces.
Yeah, I think you can find all of us on Southern Places Digital Spaces. It's our blog, and we have a couple cool. We have some cool things going on there. There's 2 calls for special issues around rurality, around digital literacies in the South that you'll find there. It's kind of a place where we're sharing our current work that we're doing, and then yeah. So I would start there if you're interested in this stuff.
Thanks, Lindy.
You can find me on Twitter at LinLuJ and also at our WordPress site.
Julie?
You can find me on Twitter at @NewLiteracy. And, of course, if you can physically come to our study group at LRA, we're going to be in the Chicky Hut number 3 on the beach.
Heather?
You can find me at Heather Plez, Plez, on Twitter. So would love to continue the conversation.
And Damani, do you want to?
I'm at Dami G on Twitter, and also check out our website and our little tiki hut. That'll be fun. So.
Well, I know I'm actually excited for the study group. A, because this is my first year where I don't have to do one, and it's going to be such a more relaxing conference.
Yeah.
But so I'm excited to see what you folks are doing in this intersection between rural literacies and digital spaces and the spaces of being physicalities or identities that we started the show with. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. You can follow up the conversation on Twitter. We usually have a chat on literacies, which would be, Ryan, you might, or somebody can help me out, not this Thursday, but next Thursday. It's the Thursday following the show. So we'll be back there talking about this, and reach out to this group, check out their blog. It was a very exciting talk, and I love doing shows where it's a field where I don't know too much about. So it was, we've all studied digital literacies, but it was interesting to really come out at them from this idea, this new construct of place. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all in December. Who knows? Maybe we'll just have a battle deck show at one of the critical. We'll bring up some new spaces in old places and see what we can do online. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in our meet spaces.
Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.